History is not a straight line. It is not some endless one-way flight into the clouds. We live in a civilization that has frankly forgotten the cold reality of winter. We have built a linear dream on a cyclical planet, constantly mistaking the temporary harvest of a prosperous era for the arrival of eternal summer. But entropy is a fundamental law of nature, and history is simply biology played out at scale. It is a circle, a wheel that turns with the absolute, unforgiving precision of the seasons.
Welcome to Zero Noise Reads. Today, we filter out the endless market noise to bring you pure, high-signal insight. We are deconstructing the timeless principles from The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. This is a profound, academically rigorous analysis that maps the architecture of time itself. It is a mental model designed to help you navigate the macro chaos unfolding around us with absolute clarity.
To understand exactly where we are heading, we first need to unlearn a deeply ingrained illusion. The modern Western world is dominated by the linear time fallacy, the unquestioned assumption that society is on a permanent, uninterrupted march toward improvement. Because of massive technological leaps, we have convinced ourselves that we have conquered nature. We use artificial light to defeat the night and climate control to ignore the cold. But the core rhythm of human society, the underlying behavioral matrix, is not governed by our machines.
The conceptual contrast here is foundational. First, consider the modern delusion of linear time, an artificial, progressive one-way street. Then, contrast that with the ancient, enduring reality of cyclical time. This is a biological regenerative rhythm. The ancients deeply understood this mechanism. They knew that when living memory ends, the cycle must restart. Entropy naturally breaks down complex structures. Society must periodically burn away the dead wood to plant new seeds. History does not merely march forward, it turns.
The fundamental unit of this turning is called the cyclum. The Etruscans originally measured time by the cyclum, defining it as the precise moment when the last person who could remember a great foundational historical event finally passed away. It is a recurring historical cycle lasting roughly 80 to 100 years, a timeline that perfectly matches the maximum length of a long human life. Think of the cyclum not as an abstract concept, but as the biological clock of human civilization.
Within that 80 to 100-year span, society always passes through a distinct matrix of four turnings. You can think of these as the four seasons of history: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Each of these seasonal turnings lasts for roughly 20 years. Notice how that 20-year block perfectly corresponds to the four major biological phases of human life: childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and elderhood. This is not just philosophical theory. It is grounded in robust, objective academic data. When mapped across centuries, we see that war, politics, and macroeconomics follow a relentless, highly predictable cycle. Society moves from the institutional building of spring into the spiritual unrest of summer, down into the fragmented individualism of autumn, and ultimately into the hegemonic wars of winter. This precise rhythm has been documented by historians over hundreds of years. The pattern is undeniable.
This brings us to the core structure itself, the four turnings. Every single saeculum must pass through these four stages: the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and finally, the crisis. Just like the natural world, every turning is equally necessary. You cannot simply skip winter, regardless of how much you enjoyed the summer. Let us break down exactly how the societal mood shifts as we transition through these distinct seasons.
The collective mood of society shifts in a highly predictable sequence. The first turning is a high. This is a spring of strengthening institutions and very weak individualism, much like the period from 1946 to 1964. Next comes the awakening, a summer of spiritual upheaval where that newly built civic order comes under attack. Think of the era from 1964 to 1984. Then we enter the unraveling, the autumn of fragmentation, where institutions weaken and individualism peaks, stretching roughly from 1984 to 2008. And finally, we arrive at the fourth turning, the crisis, winter, a decisive era of secular upheaval and survival. So, what exactly acts as the engine driving history from one season to the next? It is the human element, specifically generational archetypes. A generation is forged when a large demographic cohort moves through the distinct phases of life together. As they age, they organically shift the national mood. They replace the older generation in the societal hierarchy, and this massive demographic transition fundamentally changes how the entire civilization behaves. History creates generations, and in turn, generations create history.
Conceptually, generations move diagonally across time. Consider how the boomers, Generation X, and millennials all age through vastly different historical eras. Because a generation shares a common location on the timeline of history, they develop a collective persona, a deeply shared worldview. It is their physical aging, their inevitable movement into positions of economic and political power that literally forces the saeculum forward into the next season.
The matrix identifies 4 recurring archetypes. The prophet is born during a high and comes of age sparking an awakening. The boomers are the classic example here. The nomad is born during the awakening, grows up underprotected, and becomes the pragmatic, self-reliant survivor of the unraveling, which defines Generation X. The hero is born during the unraveling, comes of age during the crisis, and provides the immense collective teamwork required to survive. That is the millennial archetype. Finally, the artist is born during the crisis, growing up overprotected, to become the sensitive, cautious refiner of the next high, much like the silent generation.
These 4 archetypes map perfectly onto classical psychological temperaments. Academic research demonstrates that from Hippocrates all the way to Carl Jung, these 4 base temperaments constantly repeat. A highly functional society actually requires the sequential unfolding of all 4 types. You need the visionary prophet, the pragmatic nomad, the collective hero, and the sensitive artist. They balance the societal equation across time, ensuring civilization has exactly the cognitive traits it needs to endure its current season.
Which brings us to the stark, unavoidable reality of our current historical moment, the 4th turning. We are now rapidly transitioning out of the pessimistic fragmentation of the autumnal unraveling and plunging directly into the brutal, undeniable necessity of the winter crisis. This is what historians call a great discontinuity. The old civic order, which feels so incredibly stale and broken to us right now, is about to be completely dismantled to clear the ground for an entirely new social contract. What exactly happens when a society enters a 4th turning? The characteristics are brutal but necessary. It is a decisive era of institutional destruction and secular upheaval. Sudden existential threats that might have been safely ignored or debated endlessly during the autumn are now perceived as dire. This forces massive public consensus out of pure necessity. Winter boils away the trivial clutter of daily life. It forces a rebirth of civic trust, but that trust is only forged through immense personal and collective sacrifice. The single imperative becomes survival.
If you doubt this, examine the timeline. This cadence is virtually a mathematical guarantee. 1459 brought the Wars of the Roses. 1569 triggered the Armada Crisis. 1675 saw the Glorious Revolution. 1773 ignited the American Revolution. 1860 gave us the American Civil War. And 1929 initiated the Great Depression and World War II. These winters arrive on schedule, precisely every 80 to 100 years. The impending crisis is not an anomaly. It is a historical inevitability.
Furthermore, this cycle completely transcends American or even Western history. This 4-part generational rhythm has been heavily documented across 4 millennia of human civilization. From the Old Testament and Homer to the deep historical analyses of Polybius and Arnold Toynbee, the pattern is universally identifiable. It makes our current trajectory entirely predictable for those paying attention. We are simply taking our turn on the great wheel of time.
Surviving this winter requires high-leverage mental models. The hyper-individualism, the winner-take-all mentality, and the endless cultural fragmentation of the autumnal unraveling are now entirely obsolete. In a 4th turning, extreme individualism is a profound liability. Pure consumption must urgently be replaced by contribution and resilience. If you want to protect your wealth, your mind, and your family in the coming social reorganization, you have to pivot your baseline psychology right now.
Here is your actionable framework for the transition. Step 1. Permanently unlearn the linear illusion and accept the seasonal reality. Step 2. Pivot your strategy from pure individual optimization toward community survival and duty. Step 3. Build deeply resilient, high-trust, face-to-face relationships. Digital anonymity will offer no protection. Concrete personal linkages will be everything. And Step 4. Prepare to help forge a new social contract. The rules of society are actively being rewritten, and you have a duty to secure your position within that new framework.
Consider this core synthesis from the authors. History creates generations, and generations create history. The saeculum is the climate, but we are the actors on the stage. The shifting of the seasons may dictate the weather, but the generations, you and I, will dictate the absolute outcome of the storm. The winter will fiercely test our resilience, But it is precisely this intense pressure that renders a society capable of magnificent, unified action.
I will leave you with a critical question to deeply reflect upon. Will our generation embrace the brutal, demanding necessity of winter to forge a resilient and unified new spring? Or will we be crushed under the weight of the turning wheel simply because we stubbornly clung to the illusion of a linear past? Your specific role in this impending historical crisis is being written right now. It is time to prepare accordingly.
This is Zero Noise Reads. Clean insights, no fluff. See you in the next